Hello, my name is Sophia Hagelani Alba. I have seen many of you throughout the conference many times. I am super excited to welcome you to our fourth plenary session of the Global Extractivisms and Alternatives 2021 conference. We are super excited to be joined by Deborah McGregor from York University. I won't give too much on her introduction as I will be turning the floor in a moment over to Pirjo Virtanen, but I am here to share some of the technical announcements with you. So like I said, this is the fourth plenary session. We will be going today until 16:15 UTC +3. And then immediately after this session, we are going to move into our final artistic intervention and then also the closing comments for the conference, which will be happening in the same room as the artistic intervention. Once again, we'd like to thank the entities that helped to make this conference possible. As you know, you came to this conference with no charges for our participants. So thank you to the Federation of Finnish Learned Societies, the University of Helsinki Faculty of Social Sciences, and the Exalt Initiative. As you probably know by now, we are running our plenary sessions in webinar mode, which means that we can see you, but unfortunately you can't see each other. I am sorry about that, but just so you know, there's a lot of really lovely colleagues in the room. We will be taking questions via the Q&A. You can also put questions in the chat if you would prefer to use the chat rather than the Q&A. We encourage questions and comments to come at any time during the presentation. So please do not feel like you have to wait till the end of the presentation to ask those questions or make those comments. You can put them in the chat or the Q&A at any time. And then we will make sure in the Q&A session to address those questions. As mentioned, and as you probably saw as you came into the room, this session is being recorded. We will be making these plenaries available on the Exalt YouTube, maybe even as soon as tonight. And then we will also be sending a link to all registered participants after the session, so it is nice and easy for you to find these recordings again. If you have any technical challenges during this particular plenary, please feel welcome to reach out to us via the chat. I think that takes all the business out of the way. I'm going to stop my share, and I would like to turn the floor over to Pirjo for her opening words.
Thank you so much, Sophia. Welcome everyone to this last plenary of the Exalt conference. So I have a great pleasure to introduce you Deborah McGregor. She holds a Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Environmental Justice at the York University's Osgoode Hall Law School in Canada. She is Anishinaabe from Whitefish River First Nation from Birch Island in Ontario. Professor McGregor's research has focused on Indigenous knowledge, traditional ecological knowledge, environmental governance, environmental justice, forest policy and management, as well as food and water sovereignty of Indigenous societies. Recently, she has addressed the issue of climate change. In her research, Deborah McGregor has drawn from the Indigenous cultural protocols and knowledge of her people, the Anishinaabe, among others from the concept of Mino Na Mo Tsavin, living well, which gives importance to mutually respectful relations between different life forms. Professor McGregor is the co-editor of Indigenous Peoples and Autonomy, Insights for a Global Age, published in 2010. She's also a co-editor of a book called Indigenous Research, Theories, Practices and Relationships, published in 2018, which addresses community-based research and how to make space for Indigenous research in academia. She is also the author of numerous articles. Her research has been inspirational and shed light on how research can contribute to Indigenous sovereignty and self-determination. She has convincingly shown that decolonizing research is not only about involving Indigenous peoples in research, but also engaging with Indigenous research methodologies throughout the research process. So also until the dissemination of research results. She has also shown that carrying ethically sustainable research is very important, and it involves transparency and reflecting on researchers' positionality. I can also say that she has been a central figure in so-called Indigenous research paradigm, and in the processes that have contributed to the inclusion of Indigenous knowledges into public policies and decision-making. Today, Professor McGregor's talk is titled Indigenous Climate Leadership in Canada, a discussion on reconciliation, justice, and nature-based solution. Her talk addresses Indigenous leaderships, their forms, as an essential part of achieving climate justice in Canada. McGregor discusses how the involvement of Indigenous peoples necessitates dialogue on rights, governance, knowledge, justice, legal traditions, and coexistence with nature. Her presentation will explore how these themes merge to generate a path forward for nourishing planetary health. The floor and the screen is yours, Deborah.
Thank you for that. It was an amazing introduction, so appreciate that. So I'm going to share screen, but first of all, I want to thank everyone for joining me. I know it's the last part of the conference and maybe people are a little tired. Last year, I was in my community, but today I'm in Toronto. So I do have my headphones in case the construction across the road starts to get a little noisy. So we'll work through this. A lot more out of my control, believe it or not, in the city. So what you're going to hear is my thinking of around how, but there's also risks involved for Indigenous peoples in these kind of initiatives that don't involve them meaningfully. So hopefully I can address that, but at least there's some sort of recognition that's sort of moving more towards the way Indigenous people think about appropriate relationships with the natural world. So hopefully I will achieve what I would like to do today and look forward to the conversations afterwards. And once I share screen, I have no idea what time it is anymore. So I have, so someone send me a chat to tell me when my time's close to coming up, because that's just the nature of share screen once it gets rolling. Slideshow from the beginning. Okay, so Indigenous leadership, climate leadership is starting to become a thing in the Canadian context and quite potentially in other jurisdictions around the world, or at least hopefully. I guess we'll see what happens after COP26 and what some of the advocacy looks like in relation to the urgency of really addressing the climate crisis. So I wanted to talk a little bit about that and sort of the approach that Canada's taking to that, and to some extent a little bit of a contrast with how Indigenous peoples are approaching climate leadership. So I wanted to start with this image. In the North American context, Indigenous peoples have always been on the territories, had their own knowledge systems, legal systems, governance systems, practices that enabled sustainable relationships at all of creation. And when I say this, I'm not saying we were perfect. We definitely made mistakes and were destructive on occasion, but the difference is that we could deal with those on our own terms. We could problem solve, we could figure out a path out of that situation on our own terms. That's not the case anymore due to colonialism and other forces. So that's probably one of the biggest differences, is the inability to be able to address your challenges in the way that you would like. The other reason why I mention this is when you start from the assumption that I do, that Indigenous peoples are complete societies and not just populations and nations, that societies ideally like to make the best decisions possible. So Indigenous climate leadership is very strongly linked to Indigenous people and climate decision making. Because right now, in the Canadian context anyway, Indigenous involvement in any kind of climate change dialogue is contributing kind of to other people's dialogue, other people's idea what solutions are, as opposed to Indigenous governance. How do we want to govern the challenges that we're facing? So any society wants to make the best possible decisions to move forward in addressing the challenges that we all face. So I do like to start from there, because it's when you start from there and then it gives you the foundation and basis for how you would then analyze other like policy or solutions when you're coming from this place. Like, we need to make really good and the best climate decisions that we can. These are the constraints that we have to do so. How do we negotiate, navigate our way through these kind of processes, or how can we contribute to these broader processes? Because clearly Indigenous peoples wish to do that. But then we also have our own communities to take care of as well. So I just wanted to relay this particular story, and this is going to be like a very short version of it, but it's an example of how Anishinaabe weren't perfect. And I'll relate it to nature-based solutions later in the presentation. So the Pipe and the Eagle story is a classic story. And I look at the story. I mean, there's like any storytelling, it can mean different things to different people, and there's all kinds of teachings and principles to draw from the story. But I look at the story now as being a climate change story when I think about what's happening in the world, and I think about the story and what we can learn from it. So in the story. In our thinking, and of course this is all in English, so it's never really capturing how people think. The creator gives Anishinaabe people certain gifts: the pipe for peace and for connecting with the spirit world, the drum, which is the other word in Anishinaabe language is heart, so it connects you to Mother Earth. So we're given all these gifts to live a good life and to live well with the rest of the natural world, including tangible, intangible things you can see and things that you can't see. So we're given these gifts that help us enable these coexistence with each other and with the natural world. But eventually people start to become arrogant and start to use these gifts to harm other people. And so we're not basically conducting ourselves appropriately in relation to each other and then in the natural world, our ancestors, respecting future generations. And the creator gets upset about this and sends forth destruction. So the animals see this, and they don't want destruction, and they send the eagle to the creator to ask for not to send destruction on people. And because the eagle flies the highest, eagle is very significant in the Anishinaabe intellectual traditions. And the eagle petitions to the creator and says, there's the unborn yet, and they can learn to love the earth and love each other and care properly for the natural world. And the creator accepts the eagle's petition, but gives the eagle 4 days to find people on earth who are still following how to live well with the earth, this idea of Minanawadzuin. So the eagle flies for 3 days, 4 days, finally on the fourth day finds a family grandparents with their grandchildren still following the traditions. But time's running out, so the eagle flies, and so there's this time of the day called Bidabin, which is considered a very spiritual time because time kind of stands still. It's not morning and it's not night, so it's early, and that's when the eagle can get into the sky worlds where the creator is, and the eagle is able to report to the creator that they're able to find a family and who is still following the traditions, and the creator stops destruction from happening. But the eagle still flies around, is still instructed to fly around to find people who are still following those instructions and to live in coexistence with the natural world. So there's a number of I guess principles or teachings or ideas to learn from the story. This is a very short version. There's a lot more to this story than I'm telling you. Is that in the story, the natural world, the animals and plants, they're still following their responsibilities and obligations. They're doing what they should be doing. It's people who, and in the story, they're petitioning on behalf of those that are not born yet, even though people now may not be behaving in the way that they should. So I think about this story, and then when I first became familiar with the concept of nature-based solutions, I'm like, oh, maybe there's a place for Indigenous worldview and ontologies in this concept that if you, depending on how you think about nature, that nature sometimes has to bail us out of very challenging, destructive situations. But we'll talk a little bit more about that later. Anyway, I really like this. I really like this story. And to me, it completely relates to the recent IPCC 2021 report. So living well and what some of those responsibilities might look like. So here's what we know on the planet, that where Indigenous people make up only 5% of the world's population. They speak majority of the 7,000 languages and own, occupy, and use resources on some 22% of the global land area, which in turn harbors 80% of the world's biodiversity. So we know that whatever it is that Indigenous peoples are doing, and you're looking for intact ecosystems and biological diversity and integrity, it's where Indigenous peoples are caretaking the lands and waters. And in these spaces, Indigenous peoples are also speaking their languages. So to me, a lot of language also contains knowledge. So there's something to learn from Indigenous peoples, and they're still able to fulfill these responsibilities to the natural world and coexist with the natural world. In the Canadian context, the species at risk for the species that are disappearing, where most of them are found because they're being exterminated everywhere else, are in First Nation communities. So they're the ones who bear the burden of protecting and caretaking a lot of these species, whereas development is happening all over the rest of the country. So that's also something to keep in mind. Like, it's not just a story; it sort of reminds us how we're to coexist and to live well with the earth. So Planetary Code Red. So that, maybe you were familiar with this when this the recent IPCC report came out and spoke to like, we're at a tipping point at the moment. I mean, this has been called for a while, but we're there. And some changes are irreversible, and it's all caused by humans. And again, I related again to this story that partly because, in the Anishinaabe intellectual tradition, I'm trying to think, without exception, it's usually humans who are responsible for destruction when it happens. And it's usually because they're not behaving in an ethically or morally appropriately in relation to the natural world, or thinking about future generations, or honoring the responsibilities and teachings of ancestors. It means that we're, as humans, so incredibly, we're really intelligent. Like, that's one of our gifts, and we're innovative and creative, but we can also be destructive, and we can choose how we're going to use our gifts. So I read something like this, and I think, yeah, we kind of, the Pipe and the Eagle story already kind of told us this, some of the findings from the planetary health, what I call a planetary health report, because they seem to still be getting worse over time. You think that 2018 one was bad, and you thought, okay, that's pretty bad, and how could it get worse? And then it did. In Canada, I was part of the Lancet policy brief on health, and it was unprecedented in Canada, the heat waves and the wildfires. So Canada's huge, as you know. So you could see, I'm pretty sure probably in other countries as well, what the fires is, the color of the sun and the color of the moon, but also just the smoke. Like, it's even like, it's not even just the fire and what it does, but it's also the health effects that come from it in terms of the smoke. So Northwestern Ontario's huge again. We got the smoke advisories in Toronto and as far away as Ottawa. So quite far away. So it was really felt. So that's sort of just around the same time the IPCC report is coming out, that things are really reaching a tipping point. That's an image of a fire in Northwestern Ontario. So in the Canadian context, so last year I spent a little bit more time on this, is in trying to achieve Indigenous climate justice in the Canadian context. You're always contending with colonialism, historical and ongoing. And so this is just, there was a commission a number of years ago called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, of the colonization of Indigenous peoples, and the purpose was to gain control over lands and resources. And as I pointed out before, these lands and resources are also the one where there's the highest case of biodiversity, and actually sometimes more so than protected and conserved areas run by the state. So they haven't really done a great job. That's actually a picture of a residential school my mother went to. So the residential schools were intended to, the children were taken from their families and sent to these schools to basically eradicate their culture and language and learn a different culture. We also had the Murdered Missing Indigenous Women's inquiry and report that came out, that also came to the same conclusion as policies of cultural genocide existing in communities. And a lot of the violence occurs in these extractive industry areas as well, where that's taking place. So earlier this year in May and June, there was, at these sites of residential schools, of which there was, I think, over 140 in Canada, they're finding unmarked graves of children that people never knew it happened to. I guess now they have the technology to be able to identify where the bodies are buried in a lot of these schools. And Canada just made September 30th the National Day of Truth and Reconciliation, called Orange Shirt Day, because one of the residential school survivors started a movement, because when she went to residential school, they took away her nice orange shirt and made them wear the uniforms. So there's still this. So this is still very much ongoing, and there's still very much trauma experienced by Indigenous communities as they're contending with these other broader challenges facing everyone as well. So reconciliation and colonialism. So there's starting to be the linkages made between public policy and climate policy and reconciliation. The government of Canada has made these priorities in its policies. So, but what we do know from other inquiries is that state or external solutions can be a problem for Indigenous peoples. That was one of the major findings of the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples in 1996, was every time there's a solution by colonial and later Canadian government, it was wrong in relation to Indigenous people. So there's a lot of skepticism of public policy. They still continue to exclude Indigenous peoples, like it's not, again, on the terms that would be ideal for participation and having a say and having an influence. And this history has also caused Indigenous people to be more vulnerable and more at risk than Canadians in every area of well-being. So there's this like well-being index that you can find on the I guess it's Indigenous Services Canada website that measures the well-being of Indigenous peoples. It's based on the World Health Organization methodology, and then often that gets compared to the non-Indigenous population in research, and Indigenous peoples fall behind in every aspect. There's still injustice and inequity in terms of burdens and benefits. And climate change exacerbates these existing conditions. So what is reconciliation? So again, I'm drawing on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. What I do want to say about this, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was, it was really pushed for by the survivors, 7,000 residential school survivors who were still alive at the time, participated in this commission. But I point to some of the principles within it that speaks to the supporting Indigenous revitalization of knowledge, oral histories, laws, and protocols, and connections to the land is really important in reconciliation. This is what I call earth-based reconciliation. It isn't what the elders said necessarily, but basically they said, so the state tends to focus on reconciliation as just being between people. But what the elders and traditional knowledge holders said, who were part of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, was that it's not going to happen unless we reconcile with the earth itself, with the natural world, that this needs to happen, and that Indigenous knowledges and lands help with that. So that's starting to be taken up more in the Canadian context. Was the first thing I noticed, because I tend to have that lens when I look at documents, but I call it earth-based reconciliation as opposed to the state sort of ideas about what it is. And again, it's this recognition that the world is beyond the human dimension. It always includes the non-human and the natural world. That's just the worldview of people, and that's how they think. So climate change and colonialism. So I don't even know if I've ever come across a research study that speaks to climate change being any sort of advantage to Indigenous peoples at all. So it renders them disproportionately vulnerable to the current and future impacts of a changing climate. This summer, I was part of another piece to input into the IPCC, and again, I guess one of the things that kind of irritates me a lot about these processes is always sort of the last minute. And so this is in August, and we have 3 weeks to talk about climate change impacts on Indigenous peoples in Canada, US, and Mexico. And there was probably like 8 of us who were the contributing authors to this to try to document it and do it in 2 pages. So we had 2 pages, but about 40 pages of references of speaking to all the different types of changes in the vulnerabilities and risks to Indigenous peoples. One area that we included that we weren't necessarily asked to, actually we weren't, was how the broader structural colonial, rooted in colonialism, prevents or acts as a barrier for Indigenous peoples to be able to govern climate change in their own communities, like develop their own responses to what's happening in the communities and their own adaptation and mitigation strategies. So there's very little research on that, but it's starting to grow. So this again comes from just the sheer amount of hazards that are coming. This actually comes from the federal government's healthy environment, healthy economy, advanced climate change policy. So things are not looking great for Indigenous peoples in every way, not only for health and well-being, but for infrastructure, child welfare. So there's multiple crises being experienced by Indigenous peoples. So some of the challenges, just going to make sure that I'm managing my time here a little bit. So some of the challenges are environmental injustice still occurs on a regular basis. Environmental racism, actually a bill being really pushed through the federal government to look at environmental racism and justice in all legislation and actions by the government of Canada and others, and through processes like environmental assessment or through the Fisheries Act. So we'll see what happens with that. A lack of transformation. So a lot of these, what I refer to as disaster reports, they all call for transformation, and that hasn't happened yet. So ongoing colonialism, lack of basic human rights and needs are being met. So water insecurity in Indigenous communities and food insecurity, violation of Aboriginal and treaty rights. So that's just to name a few that are exacerbated also in Indigenous communities. So in terms of climate policy, so I'm involved with an organization called Indigenous Climate Action, and we're trying to address the gap of the lack of Indigenous involvement in public policy. And they released their first report on really critiquing federal government policy that I'll talk a little bit later. But essentially, one of their main findings was that despite in these public policies speaking to the involvement of Indigenous people, they were actually excluded from decision-making tables. Generally, the federal government wanted to work with the provinces, and provinces didn't really want Indigenous peoples there. So you're not really involved in the creation of climate change plans and strategies. Lack of recognition of rights, including UNDRIP and Indigenous knowledges, and that being stakeholders in the processes, even though constitutionally in Canada, there's Indigenous peoples are distinct in terms of impacts of public policy on Indigenous people, their lands, and livelihood. Ariel DeRanger, she's probably on her way to the UK right now, speaks to climate crisis. And strangely enough, like I'm also part of Climate Solutions, a 10-year think tank, a part of the expert panel on adaptation. And people didn't like to use that terminology. Like when I started on that panel 3 years ago, people didn't like if you said climate justice, well, what's that? Or climate crisis, because it was just climate change. But now it's starting to become, and this is what Indigenous peoples were, because they were passing resolutions in their communities declaring a climate crisis. And so finally, it seems to have hit home. And I suspect probably the IPCC report, the next one, or the 221, really brought that home. So she speaks to, you're never really going to be able to deal with the climate crisis unless you address the root causes: capitalism, colonialism, and extractivism. So she also says that recognition of UNDRIP and Aboriginal and treaty rights and livelihoods and knowledges is sort of one of the ways out of the situation that we find ourselves. So this is, I'm not going to, you don't have to read all the text. I'll just summarize it for you. So one of in doing these climate assessments, I'm also involved in the ones that Canada's producing through Natural Resources Canada. So they do a whole series, climate assessment series, is that you're drawing on the peer-reviewed literature, which is fine, but there's not a lot of it there's big knowledge gaps in terms of what exists, in terms of what you actually need to understand and to be able to answer a lot of the questions. So people have actually done research. Overland and another scholar analyzed what climate research has been funded. And they found that it's more heavily natural and technical science by over 770% than the social sciences. So very focused on the techno part of it, as opposed to what do we need to do to transform societies and people in order to respond appropriately to climate change. And then Carbon Brief did a piece on also the bias in the climate change assessment. So we're basing our knowledge in public policy on these assessments. The IPCC's assessments are going to go to COP26, and people are going to be using those on the basis of public policy. Found that the most influential climate scientists, of these, only 122 were women, and then were identified as Indigenous, and I believe they said 5 were from the African continent. And so they said that there's these biases in authorship. Actually, primarily, most of them were from Europe and then the United States. So there's this very much an author towards male author, very much skewed towards the interests of male authors from the global north. And I've always said that a lot of, like, all of you are researchers, that our research, the research and the body of knowledge that we have is based on the questions that we have. So my questions might be quite different than, you know, white male counterpart in Europe or the United States, because of what concerns you, right? So it creates a bias in the kind of scholarship that we have. And they pointed out that it can create blind spots toward people who are the most vulnerable. And of course, the most vulnerable are then not part of this decision making. So their experiences and knowledge don't become part of it unless they get studied. So that becomes, so I would recommend reading their piece, because it really gives you a sense of the knowledge that we're relying on in order to make the best decisions that we can. And so we need to look at other sources of knowledge. So Canadian public policy, guilty of the same thing. The Pan-Canadian Framework was the earlier policy than what we call the HEHE report, the Healthy Environment and Healthy Economy. They committed to work with Indigenous peoples, recognize Indigenous peoples as being Indigenous leaders, but it ended up being rhetoric, because there's very little in terms of support for Indigenous leadership. So recently, this summer, I did a scan, because as I mentioned, we were doing this IPCC assessment, and we were really trying to get at the governance issue, like really trying to point this out, that it isn't just how do we input it to Canadian governance or provincial governance or local governance. It was how can we support our own governance with the knowledge that exists out there. And in the Canadian context, only the Inuit Tapiriit Katami, the ITK, had a climate change strategy. No one else, that's public domain. Maybe they're out there, but I couldn't find them. I actually recently, this was in the summer, I recently had another student look again, just saying, do people have plans? Do people have strategies? Do people have some way of organizing themselves around what's happening around them? And the First Nations in British Columbia are developing a province-wide climate plan, and AFN is engaging in developing a national one. We'll see how those go. So despite this rhetoric in 2016, there really hasn't been the support for Indigenous leadership and governance in climate change. So this is again one of the findings from the Indigenous Climate Action Report that spoke to decolonizing Canadian public climate change policy. So not recognizing FPEC outlined in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, and didn't really treat people at all, Indigenous peoples, as nation to nation or government to government, which is kind of a thing here. It was more into treating Indigenous peoples as stakeholders. So Indigenous climate leadership. So when you're not involved, right, you're trying to be. So even if you are at the table, it also doesn't mean that you're being heard. Been there and done that a number of times. And so what does it look like? So people have to choose, like they have to have other ways of having an influence, and a lot of it is advocacy or activism or land defense. So that's part of Indigenous climate leadership, whereas the state often sees that, they don't see it that way at all, where people have to engage in other avenues, multiple strategies and multiple spaces to try to engage in advocacy and leadership in relation to climate change when you're excluded from these other processes. So some of the work that I'm doing, that I'm trying to, that I'm working on at the moment, is generating Indigenous climate knowledge in a way that could be mobilized. So first of all, my belief is that it's there because people are experiencing this every day. That's where it's felt the most. And but it's not mobilized into, okay, well, how can we begin to govern? How can we begin to strategize and figure out, you know, what we think is going to be helpful at different scales in the world and around us, and try to influence. But it's very land and language based. So a lot of it is based on being on the land and living there. Because when you're on the land and living there, you're assessing risk and vulnerability. You're adapting, you're mitigating, because you're not causing a bunch of carbon to be released. And so it's a more holistic experience. Whereas the way that climate assessments happen is very siloed. It's very siloed. So that's risk and vulnerability over there. And then we're going to do monitoring. And then there's mitigation. And then there's adaptation. And maybe people talk about governance and decision making. And or resilience actually is another one. So it's very siloed. And the way that a lot of the climate change funding rolls out, because there is some for Indigenous peoples, it's along those siloed lines, even though that's not how people experience it in their lives. So it's so it doesn't, again, there's a mismatch here. So what does Indigenous climate knowledge kind of look like? I don't have all the answers to this because I'm just starting to do this, work. So again, it's very much based on that nature earth creation, coexistence and living well, Indigenous knowledges, Indigenous legal traditions. And even in this process, Indigenous peoples are not rejecting Western science. A lot of them are, because you want to make the best decisions for future generations, current and future generations, is you're wanting to work with the best knowledge systems together. You just don't want Indigenous knowledges to be exploited or used in ways that are inappropriate. So it's not rejecting that. So some are trying to figure out, how do we work with these different knowledge systems to make the best decisions that we can. So I think that because there's such a huge bias in the existing climate knowledge, that you need to start looking at other knowledges that can help give us a better picture, so you can make, better responses to what's going on. A lot of it is land-based governance. It always comes back to the land, identity, language. So Canada also has this other report called Climate Science 250, and it's laying out the science agenda to address climate change. And it does acknowledge Indigenous peoples within it. It does acknowledge that Indigenous peoples haven't really been leading their own research. And if they've been part of other research, been marginalized as part of that, part of those kind of processes. So it speaks to the importance of Indigenous space and climate change science, and how do you start to create those kind of spaces. Trying to mobilize leadership in some of this kind of research. And again, this weaving Indigenous knowledge and Western science. I don't even really necessarily always like to focus on Western science per se, because even that's really diverse, but it's multiple knowledges, other kind of knowledges that are there that can help address and understand the problems that we're facing. But this was released in 2020, but I haven't really seen anything kind of come from it to make any of these recommendations. There's a number of recommendations that came out a reality in Canada. So Indigenous earth-based solutions, I call it earth-based solutions to distinguish it from nature-based, because just to distinguish it from the way that it's sort of being constructed at the moment, because it's really rooted in a particular worldview and ontology that's not Indigenous. So this is the Kimberley Declaration. So when I think about like the idea of nature-based solutions, I'm thinking Indigenous people are already thinking about this. Like first it's in the Pipe and the Eagle story, which is thousands of years old in our intellectual tradition. And then you have the Kimberley Declaration, which is part of the Sustainable Development United Nations. This was the follow-up to the Earth Summit in 1992. So they were already talking about that. They're already talking about would be sort of, you know, an Indigenous conception about what this is. So I'm going to read it to you because you can read it. But that's sort of my point here, is that it's not new to Indigenous peoples at all. And language again being key in this, in living well with the earth, like this idea of Mininamonsuin, how you're going to take care of, how you're going to live well with the earth, because our ultimate purpose for the Anishinaabe, our laws and governance and everything else, is to support the continuance of life. That's what we're supposed to do. When we don't do that, there's consequences. So nature-based solutions. So this is typically the conception of it, of what it looks like, in terms of basically trying to conserve biodiversity, and hoping that that then becomes a carbon sink but this isn't like a new idea either. So it's the power of nature to mitigate and adapt to our changing climate. This is sort of how Environment Canada is talking about this in the Canadian context. It has a potential to transform solutions and support Indigenous knowledge and way of life, but so far it's failed to do that. Because essentially the method or the approach that Canada took to this, so you see this in the public policy, was a program creation about basically planting trees. We're going to plant this many trees. And I went, well, that's not even new. That's what people have been doing as part of forest management in Canada for, I don't know, decades anyway. So it's just planting more of them and calling that a nature-based solution. So it's like I mean, it's very limited in terms of what that actually looks like. I think
Deborah,
probably,
you have 5 minutes.
Oh, okay.
Thanks.
Well, I didn't look at my. Let me just go. So that's a lot of text. So I'm just going to go through some cautions that have come from Indigenous peoples. There was a statement that came from an Indigenous caucus at a Nature-Based Solutions Summit. Is going to an ecological fix from the techno fix. So land grab. People are going after Indigenous lands because that's the intact ecosystems. It still commodifies nature and creates the human nature divide. And they're really trying to quantify it, like count things, as opposed to a lot of the, I guess, intangible parts of one's relationship with the natural world, and can also be a new form of colonization. So people are a little bit skeptical of this. To me, I just think about the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People that speaks specifically to responsibilities to future generations as being a guidepost for what can help us navigate these, complicated discussions. I am near the end. So again, I pointed this out before, that the IPCC's reports are the same as the findings of the Pipe and the Eagle story, that the natural world is a really important source of how we're going to approach the challenges that we're facing. And we need to turn, the Indigenous perspective is we need to turn to the earth and relatives for guidance, not for exploitation. And being able to listen to the land. So this is an image of the turtle, because the research I'm doing right now is on the turtle's back is there's 13 parts of the shell. That's the 13, represents the 13 moon system, and around the turtle is the 28 days. So we have 28 days and 13 moons, and tracking climate change over using that system. So living in harmony by 2050. So sort of the agenda that's being advanced by the Convention on Biodiversity. So again, so linking in with nature-based solutions. So what does that look like for Indigenous peoples and others, I noticed that they didn't, like I looked at it and it looks visionary, but I didn't really see recognition of Indigenous legal traditions and knowledges in the way that I would have expected by now. So how do I want to end this? So that's actually my niece. We were in our sugar bush. She's 2 years old. So again, just in relating it to the Pipe into Eagle story, like it's based on love for future generations and the natural world. Is that what kind of nature-based solutions does for people? How will our work benefit future generations? And what kind of ancestor do we want to be? So these are different kind of questions that we'd be, climate change questions that we would be asking ourselves that I don't really see a lot of the colleagues I have in various circles thinking about climate futures in that way. So key messages: importance of land and land-based activities for Indigenous peoples as moving towards climate solutions, accounting for Indigenous people's lived experience holistically, experiencing everything kind of all at once, not in a siloed kind of way, recognition of Indigenous governance, recognize that people's solutions can also actually create injustice in Indigenous communities because they're not part of those solutions, and recognizing climate change as a continuation of environmental change as a result of colonization. Again, that's another binary I find I deal with. So thank you. And I will stop share. Sorry, I had to go a little faster at the end, but looks like I made it on time.
Thanks so much, Deborah, for this. It was really insightful how you presented the earth-based solutions and the timeline, thinking of the future generations, and how different moral aspects and ways of relating to the environment are really linked to the issue of health, or the conception of health. How is it seen in indigenous views? I now open the floor for questions and comments. The first one who has asked the floor is Paola Minoya, please.
Yeah, thank you very, very much. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, we
Yes.
can.
Okay, yes. Thank you really very much for this wonderful presentation, and with a lot of things that you could have gone into much details. And yeah, really, we are so curious. I'm so curious to know much more. I have one consideration that in the way you were mentioning the UN DRIP, that has marked such an important step internationally for the recognition of Indigenous people's rights, but it is so poorly recognized and reminded even by other UN agencies, international policies, and so on. So it looks like there is no connection. For instance, I'm working now in the issue of in a thematic that related to the relation between indigenous knowledges and education. And if we refer to, for instance, the Sustainable Development Goals and the number 4 that relates to education, they look at indigenous peoples just as minorities that are not reached by the right education. And they don't speak about land-based education or indigenous knowledges that have to be within within education. So, I mean, there is a really, I mean, they need to break these walls. One way, since you were also speaking about the need to mobilize knowledge through, and you were showing also a group of people relating with land and nature. So I wanted to ask you if you have experience, if there are in Canada experiences of indigenous universities or indigenous schools, indigenous-based, knowledge-based schools that are also recognized in terms of also institutional education. So yeah, because I see that in Latin America there are more and more. And then secondly, I have another question that regards the terminology. What do you mean by environmental racism? If you can elaborate a little bit more. Thank you very much.
Please unmute yourself, Deborah.
I agree that there's a real disconnect between just about everything, actually. But it's weirdly big. Indigenous people can kind of see the connections, right? They're like, you don't have that. Like, how come that's not mentioned? Like, how come I don't see UNDRIP? And so, but you're right, there's this real disconnect, even within nature-based solutions, how conventional biodiversity people talk to climate change people talk to the IPBS people, right? So you're right, like that needs to be addressed. But yeah, land-based education is a thing in the Canadian context from K to 12 and also in post-secondary. So there's real efforts to try to, depending on your point of view, indigenize or decolonize the curriculum to take people out on the land. So for example, Osgoode Hall Law School, where I work, they have what they call the Anishinaabe law camps, and people go out on the land. That's part of it. You're leaving the law school and going out. My husband teaches in my First Nation community, actually, and they just taught all the teachers how to engage in land-based learning, and they're all expected to deliver some kind of modular unit on how to do that. So there's a lot of curriculum development in that. There's also one of the programs that's funded, and this was Indigenous initiative and lobbying, and then finally able to get recognition for it, is the Indigenous Guardians program. There's nowhere near enough money for it to support all the initiatives that Indigenous peoples want supported, but it's beyond the like academic institutional to get people out on the land, and that they're monitoring and they're engaging and they're caretaking and they're trying to help with conservation. A lot of it's very youth focused. So having a land-based focus is, even in research, it's recognized there. Like people would say, how come you don't have a land-based focus and why aren't you focused on youth? Like if you didn't have them, people would ask that. They're like basically, what's your problem? How come you don't have this? So it is because, so there are a number of examples, even in the post-secondary context, and increasingly so in the First Nation schools anyway. I don't think so much with the provincial schools, like where a lot of the kids go off out of the community to go to different schools. It's a weird system in Canada. First Nation education is federal, but everybody else it's provincial. Like there's this real jurisdictional kind of tension there. Environmental racism is when, depends on your definition or what you believe is intentional. Actually, no, it would be intentional. Environmental injustice or justice can be unintentional, but racism, the environmental racism isn't. So it means basically you're targeting people of color and or Indigenous peoples as places where you're going to put the worst possible polluting industry kind of thing. So you can look at Dr. Ingrid Waldron's work on this. So she's now at McMaster. So she's one of the people really pushing this bill through in Canada. So she did her research on Black communities and Indigenous communities in Nova Scotia, and where they were citing polluting industries around. So it wasn't even, because environmental racism is a lot broader because it's also discriminatory against poor people, but sometimes it's actually race. And like in Canada, in the Canadian context, you can see that that's where people are going to put, that's where the sewage is going to come out down from a city into where the First Nations people live. So it's those kind of damaging, polluting industries would be cited there, or people would be excluded from decision making. So that's the other way environmental injustice or racism happens, is people are deliberately excluded from a process, so they don't have a say in where those industries could be cited. So her research is really interesting. I could speak more about that because sort of like the father of all of this is Dr. Robert Bullard out of the United States. And he gave this really good example of environmental racism, because he said, a lot of people thought, oh, well, it was unbelievable. Like he's there as the keynote and someone just said, well, it kind of makes sense, you know, the kind of site, like think about the Dakota Access Pipeline. It kind of makes sense to kind of put it kind of where poor people are because they're not contributing to the economy anyway. That's what somebody said to him. And he said, that's actually not the case. Because in the United States, they were wanting to site near fairly well-to-do Black communities because, you know, they weren't going to put it where the poor whites were. They were going to put it through who were contributing to the economy because they were middle class. So the issue wasn't the money or the economy. The issue was race. So yeah, it's another way of looking at environmental injustice. Another layer of that. So hopefully that was kind of helpful.
Thanks a lot. There's a question about intergenerational justice. Barry Chills, would you like to tell your question?
Yeah, hi, thanks, Deborah. I just wanted to raise it so for discussion is that the ethical idea that the decisions that the human community make should be made, ideally be made, rightly made, by full consideration of thinking through the implications. If human beings are changing their relationship to the web of life, then what will be the effects on 7 generations forward, our descendants? So this is, in a sense, about like being a good ancestor. But I learned that from Indigenous peoples many decades ago. So I just wondered if it comes in at all now, if that's discussed, this element of we should be embedding in our decision making also the norm that we take into consideration. Sure. 7 generations of effect before we make the decision. So,
Deborah, you are unmuted.
Sorry, I couldn't catch the question because you.
Oh, all right. Where'd she go?
Maybe I was the one that was I the only one who couldn't hear what he said? Because I actually don't know what the question was.
Oh, so should I go through it again?
I will type it to you here, Deborah.
It's in the Q&A.
It's in the chat.
Yeah.
Oh, can I come on to an intergenerational justice, the ethical idea that decisions by, let me just see.
Yeah, by the human community about changes in their relationship to the web of life should seriously consider and take into account all that can be projected about the effects on our descendants 7 generations away, and like making that a kind of standard normative demand in all decision making from now on. That's part of climate solutions. Mm-hmm. But I learned that from Indigenous peoples myself decades ago, that principle. I mean, I didn't make it up.
Yeah. Yeah, it does come up in a lot in the narrative. I find it's a very different conversation. Like if I'm, let's say in my part of the Institute on Climate, actually it's Climate Choices, I guess, in that space compared to when you go into an Indigenous space where that's a normal thing to be talking about. Like that's so far not in the radar. Like they're trying to figure out the cost of climate change and they're really limited by the data. Like I find it really data driven, like that principle of like, they wouldn't know how to make that kind of decision. Whereas it seems to be more a normal kind of thing to do in an Indigenous context. So I find the obsession with data, that's almost always my input is like, why are we focusing on these like indicators of health? Why are we focusing, we're doing the infrastructure report. Why are we only looking at this infrastructure and not actually one that kind of matters more to Indigenous people? They're like, oh, because it's the one we have data on. And I went, oh, okay. So again, we're only getting the information from what there happens to be data on. So I don't know. And I think to me, it would really advance the ideas of Indigenous leadership and generating that Indigenous climate knowledge, because it's going to be so diverse. Like when I think about Canada, Niska knowledge, Inuit knowledge, Anishinaabeg knowledge, Mi'kmaq knowledge, but you're going to have to be able to draw out a set of principles if you want to feed into federal policy, right? So, but there's going to be similarities in those kind of principles. And I think that would be one of them, like, again, in the Canadian context anyway, and a lot of the US where I've connected with folk, That's what they talk about. So you can draw out these kind of principles so that you can advance and advocate for that, because there's going to be diversity in people's climate change knowledge.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
thank you for
Thanks
raising that.
very much. Yeah, that's great. Thanks.
Thanks a lot. So then we have a question from Kutu Wayesa. Would you like to present your question yourself live? Sophia, can we do that?
Are we looking for somebody, or is it in chat or Q&A?
Yeah. I think he is coming as one of the panelists. Well, I can read the question by Kutu Wayesa. He is saying, thank you for your interesting presentation. Do you foresee possibilities of building solidarity based on commonality of environmental injustices perpetrated across Indigenous, non-Indigenous divide, while still recognizing the specificities in both?
Yes, like that's actually necessary to have that kind of solidarity. But I guess from an Indigenous perspective, if you're on Indigenous lands, it should be Indigenous led, because a lot of the times in the Canadian context, NGOs and others have sort of appropriated kind of, Indigenous organizations and perspectives into their advocacy, which then ended up sometimes down the road harming Indigenous people and their lands, right? I didn't show you maps of Canada's like historical treaties, current treaties, modern day treaties and treaty negotiations, but pretty well all land in Canada is Indigenous. And so wherever these sort of movements are taking place, that needs to be recognized. And so that whatever's Indigenous about it, whether it's knowledges or anything, doesn't get appropriated inappropriately, because unfortunately that's happened too much and people are a little bit skeptical. But it's also recognized that's completely necessary. That's sort of how youth are organizing, actually. They're organizing, they're going across all kinds of boundaries. I guess they're not as hung up on politics and who's getting funding from where. So they just want to get stuff. They just want to get stuff done. But solidarity is, an allyship is really important. But even within those movements, there's still appropriate, I guess, principles and ways to approach it that's respectful. Yeah.
Yeah, and I guess when you talked about earth-based solutions, they really work for both non-Indigenous and Indigenous and different kinds of local communities. Actually, I would like to ask about your new project. You mentioned that you are really thinking what can be helpful and in what kind of scales, and trying to figure out these questions in local communities. So did you start working in your own community in Birch Island? And what is emerging? What your people is finding out? What is the earth saying?
So the way that I'm approaching that is I'm trying to frame it from an Anishinaabe perspective. So you need to have we all have frameworks for how we deal with this, right? And so, different Indigenous peoples are going to have their different frameworks. So for Anishinaabe, we understand the world in terms of 4 elements: fire, water, land, air. And so we look at those, and one of the, again, foundational ones is what we call the 13 moons. It's actually one moon going through 13 phases, and it's connected to the turtle. That's why the turtle is significant. So the turtle shows up as being part of the 13 moons, or the different seasons that happen and what's supposed to be happening in those seasons. Because one of the criticisms that comes from the scientists is they say, well, you don't have the baseline, so we can't tell what the change has been over time. And we say, yeah, we do. We have the 13 moon. We know exactly what's supposed to be happening, when this particular moon happens, like when the ice has started to break up, and when we're going to be going into the sugar bush kind of thing, like to make the maple syrup. So it's also a form of governing. so it's then taking like those are like conceptual frameworks and then applying it to a climate change context. So I've only completed one round myself. So I started last October, and you have to go to the same place. So making the observation in Toronto, because like really right now, my raspberries are still growing in downtown Toronto, whereas up north, like no, that finished 2 months ago. So like where my community is, right? So you're always going to the same place, and the framework, because you need to do it consistently, is through the 13 moon, which is interesting because it's not a linear concept; it's cyclical in terms of how it works. So you're also challenging that linear kind of idea approach to everything. And so no, yeah, there's quite different different changes and things that I'd never really noticed before, actually, because I wasn't paying attention. I just you know, but now I'm like, okay, what is happening with the air and what's happening with the water? So water is what I'm paying particular attention to. So one of the things that's happened quite dramatically this year was because there wasn't a lot of snow, which in the place like Toronto, people are like, yay, but that's bad actually, because it means you don't have the water flow in the spring. And so it's very dry. So the water levels are really low actually, which affects then the fish and the birds and everything else. But there's also things that I'm noticing that are stunning and beautiful. So I learned that loons, which are in the waters around where I'm from, so just before they're about to migrate, they meet. So they're like, for us, we counted around 80. We're like, what are they doing out there? And they're all chatting with each other, but it's not like their usual calls. So they basically meet for a few days, a bunch of them, when they're usually alone before they go on their migration. Hummingbirds know when to leave. Even if you have a hummingbird feeder out, they don't care. They know when they need to go. So I live in a place in Birch Island. I never really noticed the birch. But in November, when the leaves fall and things look kind of gray, you really notice the birch. And I went, I really noticed the birch now. No wonder why it's called Birch Island. And so that one of the trees then became one of my markers that I would go back to all the time. So one of the projects we did over the summer with youth, they're actually in the process now. We finally got the license for the design program, is a graphic novel or a comic or some kind of visual. So I hired youth over the summer to then start tracking that themselves, because in their lifetime, over decades, they will start to see what some of those changes are, probably more rapidly than I would have noticed, because things are just happening so much faster now. So that's what they did. So they start learning the skills of observation. What do you see? What do you smell? What do you taste? You know, in the summer, I'm like, I smell smoke, even though that's, 1,000 kilometers away, and I'm not supposed to go outside and breathe it. So that's what we're kind of, those are one of the big things that I noticed, was places that were wet, wetlands and streams were completely dry. So because there wasn't the snow, you need to have the snow, and there just wasn't the water and the water levels. And the Great Lakes is huge, like I think the largest kind of freshwater bodies on the planet, and the levels dropped. So that's fairly significant for all kinds of reasons. So it's just paying attention to the natural and building the skills to be able to do it is actually hard. You have to be attentive. I'm used to like reading, right? And now I have to like figure out what's going on when I'm not used to it. And then we're trying to work with youth and train them they're probably way better at it than I am, because they're not as schooled yet and being very text-based. Anyway, I'm liking the project, and I'm waiting to see what they come up with. But part of it is identifying what your framework is for how you understood change.
Very good. Thanks so much for your elaborated reply. There's one more question by Sabahet Ramjilovic Suominen. I don't know if you see it in the chat. It's about self-governance and self-determination.
Sorry that I have to break in here. We actually have a session immediately after this session. And so I do agree that it is a super fantastic question that is raised. But unfortunately, I really don't think today we're going to have time to get to it. And I'm really, really sorry. I hope everybody reads that question in the chat And I hope that we will have some future times where we can have a little bit more space. But for today, I'm so sorry, but we're just right at the end.
Yeah, I was just about to say that I will transfer the question by Saba Hetta and also by Maria Eström. And if there are any others, I will transfer them to Deborah. Thank you so much for your talk. And thanks everyone for joining this conference. And please enjoy the last session, that is the artistic intervention. Then we also have a closing summing up by Anja Nygren. So thank you so much, Deborah, and everyone who joined our session, the plenary talk today. Thank you so much. Kiitos all.
Miigwech, everyone.
Yes, thank you so much, Deborah, for that fantastic keynote. So many amazing things that you've given us to think about and reflect on. And I do apologize that we always, the question time always ends up running so short because there's so many things to ask. And I apologize that I always have to take the role of stopping us. I don't want to, but we are heading over to Mirko's artistic intervention. I did watch it earlier. It's really spectacular also. So I do encourage everyone to, after this, head over to that room. And thank you so much, everyone, and Piero for your fantastic sharing. Thank you so much. Sorry. And Piero, I will send you the chat text after this, so you'll have all the questions. You're muted at the moment.
Yes, I did note them down, but it's better if you
Good.
send them
Okay.
all in one file. That's easier. Thanks a lot.
I will send them all in one file. See you soon.
See you soon. Bye.